Hey, hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the panel session as part of the University of Waterloo's Teaching and Learning Conference. And this is going to be a recorded session. My name is Minzee Kim, and I am a fourth year PhD candidate in statistics. And I have taught introductory stats course for science students. And my mentor was Dr. Chelsea Uggenti, who is also the course coordinator for the course. I'll be your moderator for this session, which is titled How Do Graduate Student Instructors in STEM Navigate Challenges with the Help of Their Mentors? So, in this panel, we'll explore how disruption and uncertainty in higher education have impacted graduate student instructors and how mentorship can play a pivotal role in supporting their teaching and well-being. So today we're joined by three graduate student instructors from STEM disciplines and their mentors. So we have Rachel Beaver and Dr. Marcel Pinheiro from the Department of Biology, Jennifer Ellingham and Dr. Beth Weckman from the Department of Mechanical and Mechatronics Engineering, and Zachary Van Oosten and Dr. Michael Wallace from the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Science. So we'll dive right into a moderated session where I'll ask our panelists a series of questions. But from the audience, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat, and we'll do our best to bring them up in the conversation. And we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end for about 10 minutes. Okay, so with that, let's get started. I'll begin by asking a question for our mentees, so the graduate student instructors, to share their background on what courses they have taught and how did you manage high levels of stress while meeting teaching and research demands, and what role did mentorship play in managing this stress? So if anyone wants to unmute themselves and go ahead, that'd be great.
Sure, I can start. So yeah, I was teaching Stat 231 here in the fall term of 2024. How did I manage stress through it all and kind of continue to do research? As I would say, my number one thing was just transparency with my supervisor. So if I had a meeting with my supervisor and he said, "Okay, can you work on this? When can you have it done?" I'd be like, "Well, I have to prep lecture slides this week, all these things. Please, could you give me instead of maybe the usual 1 week, give me 2 weeks to do it, right? Just be transparent with your supervisor and kind of just set proper expectations for yourself. Don't always think you can do it all. Be reasonable with yourself, be kind to yourself, and just realize that, yeah, you're probably not going to do as much research as you would like during your teaching term."
I guess I can go from there. Jennifer Ellingham, a PhD candidate in mechanical and mechatronics engineering, and I have twice taught the ME 203 Ordinary Differential Equations course for undergraduate students. And Beth is my supervisor, and so we definitely had some uh, clear discussions that when I'm teaching, I don't have as much capacity to be doing on the research side of things. And so knowing that I wanted to be doing the teaching, that was factored in from the beginning in terms of the timeline that I was looking to complete my PhD and how long different tasks were going to take, especially when I was teaching at the time. And the other thought that I had was, um, which was pointed out to me, is don't do a TA role or a teaching role in the term before you teach because there's a lot of preparation work that goes into it. And so that was some advice that I got, which was definitely very helpful and probably saved my sanity.
I guess I'm last then. I taught biology 309 twice. And in terms of managing stress, I think grad school prepares you pretty well for like doing lots of things sort of simultaneously at the same time. Um, and I guess I went into teaching terms knowing that it was going to be extra busy. Because I was working to not let it get in the way of research progress. So I think I just went in knowing that it was going to be really busy, and that was all right.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up question with that. So some of you have mentioned you've taught two terms. Did you find anything different in how you managed stress between the first time you were teaching and the second time that you have taught?
For me, I found it, I wouldn't necessarily say easier the second time around, but I had a better grasp on what was going to happen and what the stress was going to be. Um, so I could factor that in.
So I also taught the term after I taught Stat 231. And I will just say that, yeah, like it gets easier. I think there's always going to be a baseline amount of stress. But definitely once you've seen something once, it makes it easier the second time. So that it's definitely the most nerve-wracking experience is that first time when you've never done it before. You got to learn kind of what's going on in the background. So yeah, that's what I'll say.
And I might jump in here. That's absolutely the same for any professor as they start doing it too. So I think that's a human response to unknown situations, right? I mean, even I've been in at Waterloo for, well, at the retirement end, and every term I step into a new class, I still have those nerves, even though I may have taught that course many, many times before. So very natural response.
I have a quick follow-up question for each of the mentors. Speaking about stress, was there anything that you did in particular with your mentees to try to help them to, deal with that stress, or more specifically, to try to have less stress on them, let's say, if you were involved in the course specifically, which I know a few of you were.
I could maybe start with that. So, because Jennifer was teaching a course that I had taught previously, what I did was basically try to transfer my information across to her with some points on maybe what were the easier and more difficult parts of the course to teach so that she could, and then she adapted those because you have to be teaching with your own style. You can't be teaching from entirely from somebody else's notes. But I think that at least gave her a starting point for some of the key elements in the course that over the years I knew where students tended to glitch and where they didn't glitch. So I tried to convey some of that just so she had a bit of awareness of, okay, this couple of weeks might be a bit difficult because, everybody will be down your throat kind of thing.
Jump in next. I can say that I would echo what Beth said. Those are, trying to get any materials that someone can look at is really helpful, even if you're not necessarily going to use all of them. Assessments are really good to have too. Anyone that's taught a number of times knows that that first time you write an assessment before it's road tested, oh boy, you're going to have some trouble. So anything that they can look at that you can have an extra time to meet with somebody just to go through what they're planning is I think really helpful. And then I'll just add, so I'm also associate chair undergrad, so I kind of contribute to choosing TAs. So if there's TAs involved in the course, keeping sessionals in mind and trying to give them experienced TAs is super helpful as well.
Yeah, I can just add, I think in my case, one of the main things I do with anyone that I'm teaching with is, throughout the term, before term starts, I have a very specific schedule figured out. So the deadlines of all the assignments, times of all the exams, and then I make sure that anything where we need to review that work, so where, my co-instructors are going to be reviewing those materials, always as much time as possible is given for that. Because I think one of the challenges, especially if you are teaching whilst also completing, say, a PhD, as has been alluded to already, you are spinning an awful lot of plates. And one of the biggest challenges when you're trying to spin a lot of plates is when you get suddenly something lands on your desk and you're asked to review a midterm with 2 days notice or something like that. So as much as possible, I try and give as much lead time as we can for anything that requires sort of review or a second look, so that you can sort of slot that into your schedule as best will fit in that case. And this requires ahead of time sort of a lot of kind of prep work. So I have sort of schedules figured out before term even starts. But then once term gets going, removing some of those overheads, so you're not trying to think about your schedule whilst you're actually teaching, can be a big sort of stress reliever. It's just, when something needs doing, you say it needs doing, and everyone has lots of time to figure that stuff out.
Great, thank you so much. So the next question is more specific to the time that we live in 2025. So, what was it like teaching during a time of major changes, such as emerging from the pandemic, adapting to students who are more used to recorded lectures and online materials, and navigating rapid developments in technology and AI with ChatGPT? And did you have to do anything different than what you have expected when you started teaching?
So I
Yeah.
guess I can start.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead, Rachel. You.
Oops. So I taught in 2024. So COVID was kind of like we were fairly well out of it. So there wasn't quite the uncertainty that some people might have faced a couple of years earlier. I think that COVID brought a couple of good changes, like recording lectures and putting things online and things like that, which just are helpful in general for when students can't make it in person. So that's something that I did, made sure to record everything and have it really clearly outlined on Learn. Yeah.
So yeah, I would also say, I mean, Michael and I both recorded all of our lectures and live streamed them and all that. So our students for our course were, they got to continue to have these recorded lectures. So we didn't kind of have to deal with the fact that maybe they were expecting that, but didn't have that. I will say this was when I taught in the fall term of 2024, ChatGPT, like that's when everybody was just starting to really get to use it. Um, and so that was very interesting, right? That's kind of interesting to see kind of how well ChatGPT could actually solve an assignment that you gave, right? Like you'd go try it yourself and you would see that. And it was very new. And I would say like how we like because that was happening during the term, I'm assuming that educators from here on out are now really trying to figure out how you kind of combat AI usage in the classroom. But I will just say, like, it was very interesting to see kind of that become a phenomenon of ChatGPT being used by, you know, pretty, students and probably some instructors alike. So I'll just say that.
I guess I can do sort of not quite the opposite, but I started teaching during the pandemic. And so I do have a couple of examples. One in particular is related to the video platform. As I remember, 2 days before term, Beth and I spent, I don't know, it was probably 2 hours in the lecture hall trying to get Zoom to work. And then the next day we were told, which is the day before term started, that no, you have to use Teams instead. And so it was a really rapid pivot at that point to figure out how to get Teams to work then in the classroom, but also on the back end of getting things to line up. And so I think that was we ended up sort of dividing and conquering a little bit to be able to pivot quickly on that. And uh, I don't know if it's similarly, but in terms of Gen AI, I remember we were partway through a term when that sort of came up, and we had to look at some of the assessments and think about um, what were we going to do for like a major project in the course when so much was still unknown. And so I think actually we ended up changing it a little bit every term, exactly what we were doing. as things evolved, but that was another one that had a pretty quick change as well. I don't know if you wanted to add anything there, Beth.
No, just that this is a math course, and so doing it by video is somewhat challenging when you're used to everything being done on the board. So what I did was I talked to, luckily I knew some of the first year students who had been in COVID the term before Jennifer and I were trying to sort all this out. And they said, oh, they most liked the prof that had used PowerPoints with blanks. So we kind of, I luckily had translated some of my notes that way. And then that certainly helped as well, because when you're recording on a video, if the students can't see the blackboard or the whiteboard on the video, they get extremely frustrated. And our classrooms weren't designed quite right to do that. That's why the team Zoom thing was critical a couple of days ahead of the course. So it is a balancing act between the technology and then how you present the course as well. So that's again where the student lecturer and mentor can often work together to kind of come up with a good solution, really.
For those mentors who had the graduate student instructor recording lectures, let's say, because that's the example that we kind of started with, was that a decision that you maybe made or suggested to them, or did you leave that open to them to decide? Kind of how did you go about that autonomy and decision making as the mentor?
So having taught during the pandemic, I had recorded all my lectures and it really saved everything, right? Because then the next term when stuff was kind of half and half and nobody was quite sure what was happening, not only did we have a set of previously recorded lectures, but we also could record them during that offering of the course. So I highly recommended to Jennifer, who had been my TA in one of those two offerings at least, to just continue to do the same thing because the students had kind of embraced that eventually after the initial shock.
Yeah, for me it's similar. So I've been, I was recording my lectures before COVID, because from a personal perspective, I think lecture recordings have always been something where they dramatically improve accessibility to your course for all sorts of students for all sorts of reasons. And then COVID, of course, was this significant culture shift where I think we've moved to a scenario where now everyone was forced to do things online and recordings and so on. We've realized it's not actually as hard as I think people perhaps thought, and it's established a greater and I think reasonable expectation from students for this kind of content delivery. So my advice, so when I work with anyone as a co-instructor, regardless of whether they're a junior faculty or a student instructor, I always stress that it's their class, so it's up to them how they teach. It's ultimately their decision. But at the same time, I made it clear that in my sort of professional and pedagogical opinion, that streaming and lecture recordings are the preferable way to deliver a course. But I also was, we need to be pretty, let's say, realistic, I suppose, about the fact that, it's something students have come to expect. And so if you don't do things like lecture recordings, you are going to run into issues with students who are going to be potentially less thrilled with your course delivery if you're not providing those kinds of accessibility options. So it's always ultimately up to how my co-instructors want to teach, but I'll give them the benefit of my experience of what I personally think, as well as the feedback I've received from students, because students overwhelmingly give overwhelmingly positive feedback about lecture recordings. For we don't really need to get into why, but that's certainly the case.
I'll just jump in. I think those are really good points. I will add one maybe wrinkle onto that, though, is that particularly in a where you have a lecture. So in biology, right, we'll have in-person hands-on labs and then conceptual lectures. And one of the things that we've found quite a bit, and that I've had to speak with sessionals because you don't realize this at the time, is that students will sometimes think that listening to recordings over and over is actually studying. So I've tried to encourage everyone, but sessional instructors as well, to really point out to students that that's not, you can't study just by watching videos over and over again at 2 times speed while you're folding your socks, right? So this has been, I think we talk about change, and like the change is ongoing, right? We have a lot of students that went through high school at a time that they weren't taught how to study in a traditional way, shall we say. Um, and it's led to things like this, where we have to add some of that remedial, like how do you study for a course? Um, that has to sort of get injected into many of our courses. So it's how have things changed? There's more that we've got to do, right? We've got to teach, we've got to figure out the tech side of things. We have to remind students how to study. Like this has now become all encompassing.
If I can just jump in as you all were discussing this, I also remembered back to the first time I was teaching, I actually went back and watched the videos of Beth teaching. So I had a good idea of timing and the questions that are common from students and how to answer them. So that was actually really helpful for me as well as an instructor. After the fact, because the videos existed, I went back and watched, especially on the topics that I was maybe not as comfortable with. I would go in and go, what questions might I get? And can I get a good idea of what I might be able to answer? So that was actually very helpful down the road as an instructor.
Thank you for that great discussion on the recorded lectures. So, kind of a more broader question then, stemming from that. Were there moments when you and your mentor had to problem solve or adapt together due to uncertainty? What did they look like, and what have you learned from that?
Essentially, was there anything that came up while you were teaching and or while you were mentoring that graduate student instructor that, kind of made you had to pivot or adjust or something along those lines?
So I think maybe Zach's memory is better than mine. The only thing that comes to mind for us was this we've touched on this before, this issue with generative AI, where during at the start of term, you know, I anticipated to some extent that students would be using generative AI to solve assignments. I was not at that point as aware of the extent to which these tools are developed for solving the kinds of assignments we were working with. So our assignments were data analysis exercises with sort of real data. And it became clear very quickly, I think, after reading the first assignment, that the use of generative AI was pretty widespread, and that it was pretty good at what the task we were setting. So there was some extent where during the term when I was sort of writing the assignments, I put sort of pivoted a little bit more into trying to design some elements of the assignment to be particularly challenging for those ChatGPT type tools. And Zach and I both sort of put a bit more time into, like, we would review sort of some randomly chosen students' work and things like that to see what kinds of answers they're coming up with and to try and learn ourselves more about what these tools were and weren't able to do. So that was a little bit of adapting we had to do. For the most part, it was the course sort of ran like it always does. It's a course it's a core course in our faculty, so it's run for years and years and years and years. But definitely those emergent technologies, I think, are the places where we saw some avenues where we needed to have some amount of flexibility to try and adapt the course in the right direction.
I think one from our perspective, and Jennifer, feel free to jump in, was when things suddenly in the middle of a course went from fully recorded to now it's hybrid. You're supposed to allow students in the classroom. You're supposed to have people online. You're allowed everybody to do everything. And suddenly now the whole discussion, like when you're fully online, you know that the discussion is coming through the chat, or we have live links into the classroom so we could hear the students asking questions. When you're fully in class, you're expecting the people in class to ask those questions and you kind of monitor your lecture accordingly. When you suddenly have half in the chat and half coming from the classroom, um, you have to determine a new way of using your TAs, let's say, I think is what we ended up doing, where we actually had a TA monitoring the chat because as an instructor, especially when you're on Teams, you can't see the chat. Right? And so you can see your lectures, which you're projecting to the students, but you're kind of blind other than that. So unless they actually say something live as well, which the classes after COVID tended not to be particularly vocal, you don't actually know people are asking questions. And so it took a lecture or two to kind of figure that out and then adapt how we were going to do it, which was to have a live person in the classroom monitoring the chat to pass it on. Now, that could be because typically our classes before COVID had all been all in person, right? So there hadn't been this online presence, but nonetheless, it was a bit of a, well, whoops, we have to start to regroup and do something different here.
I can just jump in, Rachel. You feel free to correct me, but I think our issues were predominantly just navigating procedural things, right? How to upload exams into Odyssey or whatever system that you're using, dealing with accommodations, maybe some disruptive students. So those things that you don't really know until you have to go through it would be, I think, the only thing we had to tackle.
Thank you. Anything from the mentee side that you guys want to mention before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I guess I'll just mention because we were like Michael was mentioning about like, generative AI. Um, I think overall that was just something we had to kind of sit back and watch and maybe this would educate you on what you can do in future terms. But I mean, in my like the best thing I could probably have come up with is you just put less of a weight to take home assignments and put more of a weight into in-person examinations where, they're there, they don't have a computer in front of them. And obviously the syllabus was already set, so that's something you can't really change once the term's going on. So I think, I guess the moral of the story there is like sometimes it's not always like something you have to change, you can kind of just sit back and watch it, try to educate yourself on what you can do in future terms, but it's not that you don't have to sound the alarm and worry about fixing something that term, right? You can just sit back, watch it, try to educate yourself on where to go in future terms.
And you know what? That's perfect because obviously, I imagine for all of the graduate student instructors here, having that experienced mentor to help navigate those situations was probably beneficial to all of you. And so, one question that we had was about that mentorship and the communication and feedback between the mentor mentee pairs. So, we just want you to talk about that communication, that feedback. Was it frequent, less frequent? Was it, more hands-on, more hands-off? What worked well, do you think? What didn't maybe work well? And I know that maybe is a hard thing to ask because you're all in the room together. But yeah, just talk to us a little bit about that communication between mentor and mentee.
For Beth and I, we tend to go with more of an as needed kind of discussion style. We didn't really have like a let's meet every week at this time. It was more when things were going off the rails. There was, okay, a couple of times a day I was jumping over to Beth's office and what do I do? And when things are going smoothly, there's probably weeks between actually talking about um, different things. And so it was much more of an as needed uh, and um, like it was if I had a question, typically I would go and ask Beth. Um, yeah, and I think We both tend to go work better with sort of in-person or video chat, depending on whether we're in pandemic times or not. Just because a million emails back and forth is not quite the same as having one face-to-face discussion. But again, we've had those email chains going as well when face-to-face wasn't possible. So it was sort of whatever it needed to be, which worked well for us.
Yeah, so I agree. Michael and I was whenever it kind of needed to be. When it came to communication between us, it was mostly for, things in the background, like midterm grades just came out. We hadn't released them yet. We wanted to talk about it, right? Michael and I are very lucky. Our offices are on the same floor, very close to each other. So most of the time I could just go and just kind of peek my head around the corner to see if he was in his office and just knock. And he was always very kind and could meet me as long as he didn't have students or something he was talking to. So yeah, it was nothing really like we never had weekly meetings or anything like that. It was kind of what's going on in the course right now, what's the new information we just got, how can we deal with this? And then we would meet if we needed to talk about those things.
I think in biology, it's also sort of an informal kind of as needed thing. I found that Marcel, but also other experienced instructors in the department were really willing to answer simple questions that they had already faced before. And then the one thing that I'll add that Marcel implemented was a guest, like he would come as a and watch a lecture and then give you written feedback on your teaching style and anything that could be improved or was done especially well, which I found helpful.
And from an instructor or mentor perspective, I think one reason the open door policy kind of works is because the problems, if typically ODEs is 3 times a week for an hour each time, some other courses would be 3 hours each week. But if you've got a problem on Monday and you have to wait till Thursday to get that problem answered, there's already been another class in between. So one thing I did mentor Jennifer on is if something comes up, the quicker you can address it, the better off you are generally, because then you don't get the rumor mill going through the classroom of this and that and the other thing, and you end up with a blown out of proportion issue that could have been handled very quickly. And so that was sort of the back end of the conversations being more of a drop in when you need something, because I don't mind helping you.
So we have a question in the chat asking about the kind of role of ethics for inclusivity in STEM education and if there's any ethical framework for instructors to follow. And I'd like to add to that of just maybe I'll gear this more towards the mentors than the mentees, but talking about like inclusivity and supporting students with diverse needs, were there any recommendations or suggestions that you gave to your mentors along those lines?
I'll just go quickly. In Ontario, we have the AODA, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and it really kind of behooves us to do a number of things to make sure that we have at least some baseline accessibility for students. We have an accessibility office that we oftentimes will work with. So just sort of introducing the idea of reaching out to them if need be, but also that students will reach out to you as well. But also talking a little bit about privacy and keeping things confidential with students if they do disclose that they have a disability or these sorts of things. So, I think it's just good pedagogy to try and do the best that you can to allow accessibility. We don't have hard and fast guidelines per se, beyond what, ministerially we have to do. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I mean, in the course Zach and I were teaching, we were a 4-section course, and so a lot of accessibility issues in effect get handled centrally. So one of the most important things when you're working in a multi-section course is you have to have very, very clear communication between instructors about any kinds of uh, requests from students regarding certain things. So, very common things might be needs surrounding assessments. When it comes to anything that's sort of an accessibility request, so related to the accessibility services or any kind of health condition, yeah, just to echo the previous comments, I was made sure to advise Zach that you do need to be very careful about privacy concerns. I think a lot of it's more common than it should be for emails to get forwarded around, but within courses when they shouldn't be. Certainly, if a student contacts you personally with potentially information that may be sensitive, it's very important that you make sure that you don't share that information without explicit student consent. So we had to make sure we had some sort of guidelines and systems in place to ensure these kinds of things were followed carefully. But beyond that, as I said, in the course of our size with multiple sections and hundreds of students, most of these kinds of issues are handled in a more centralized way as best we can.
And I would concur and just add that it's also working with your mentee, who in my case, Jennifer, was very, very cognizant of accessibility issues and added some things to the course that I didn't have in there, which I thank her for. And then we could carry on from there. But again, we kind of discuss them together, make sure, the fairness across everybody. And then, yeah, again, the confidentiality is critical.
And if I can just add, I think part of the question was also ethics. And so I'll just mention that because I have done some research with respect to the teaching materials and using the students in the classroom. And so there are definite ethics, like we have actual ethics applications through the ethics office in place before the term starts to make sure that that side of things also gets covered off as well.
Thank you. So, we talked about mentor relationships, and I wanted to discuss a bit further on that. So, what was your initial expectation of mentorship in teaching, both from the mentee perspective and the mentor perspective? And did this change over time? And if so, how?
So I would say to start it off, like when it comes to how this was going to work between me and Michael when I started teaching. I actually had no clue. I had very little clue what this was going to look like. And as it kind of evolved, I realized that, Michael has done this many, many times. He has taught this, and specifically Stat 231, I know he's taught many, many times. And so, it just came to me just trusting him. If I was ever confused about something, I would ask him. He would tell me what he's seen many, many times with this course, and then, you just move on from there. I would say nothing. I mean, and this is a good thing. Nothing major really came out during the term. I would assume that probably Michael would agree it was a very standard running a Stat 231, which overall is, I think, a good thing, right? Um, yeah, I had a great time. I feel like I learned a lot. Like there's a lot that happens in the background of a course, as an undergraduate student, you've taken many, many courses, and so you know at least what the classroom looks like, but what happens outside the classroom, you have absolutely no clue. And so obviously having a mentor for that makes the process a lot smoother because there's, a bunch of systems in the background, many things that you've never seen before as a student. And so when you're teaching that first time, you have to learn these things. And that's definitely where the relationship with your mentor is most helpful.
Yeah, I can just add to that. So as Zach said, I have taught this course many, many, many times. And so this meant I had experiences in terms of expectations of a mentorship role coming into it. I've been the senior instructor on this course probably half a dozen times by now. So I've worked with junior faculty, I've worked with postdocs, I've worked with PhD students, and so I don't really come into these situations with particularly specific expectations because you don't know what working with someone is going to be like until you work with them because everyone is different, of course, and especially when it comes to teaching, there are people who've taught for years, and people who are teaching for the very first time, and you may think there's a correlation between experience and how they're going to perform or how they're going to approach things. And it's not a very strong correlation. Let's put it that way, at least in my experience. So when I come into this sort of scenario, I try very hard not to have expectations because I think if you come in, expecting that the person you're going to work with is going to, have a certain aptitude or a certain attitude or a certain level of interest or work ethic or whatever it is, you are effectively just bringing your own potential biases into a scenario that isn't very helpful. So when I come into these situations, I primarily just aim to establish what the expectations of being an instructor in the course are, make it clear what I'm sort of there for, and that I'm there to help, basically, and that if in doubt, ask a question. I think that's the single most important thing I rely on when working with others who haven't maybe taught this course as much as I have. Is the only thing I ask of them sort of on day one is, if you're not sure about something, ask me, and that way you avoid a huge number of potential issues.
I guess I can go next. So for me, I had, I think, a reasonable idea of what teaching mentorship might look like with Beth because she's also my research supervisor. So we already sort of had a bit of a rapport and a way of doing things figured out before teaching. And so I was already aware that Beth is really good about being open to any and all questions. And then also being like willing to try something new, which worked really well. Also, uh, Beth was really good about being able to provide some experience and context for things of me maybe being a little bit on the naive side sometimes of this would be an amazing idea, and Beth going, okay, but and so I don't think that um, the expectations really changed too much. I had a pretty solid idea, but I do think I had maybe a greater appreciation for uh, Beth's advice and the importance of actually having experience with doing some things. I think I gained an appreciation for that more than actually having my expectations changed, if that makes sense.
And I would, just following on and looking at the question in the chat, I would agree that in terms of mentoring someone through a course the first time, that the experience of the mentor with that course is very, very valuable in terms of being able, because there's in the general admin of a course, maybe there are many people who could help a new instructor with those kinds of things, like getting Odyssey and some of the other systems working. But in terms of the course and the class's response to that subject material, I mean, that's a huge part of running a successful course. It's probably one of the most important parts of running a successful course. And so when the new teacher has questions, being able to have that open discussion with them about the experience that you've encountered as an instructor of that particular set of concepts, I think is really, really critical.
Can I jump in on the question from the chat as well? I think that's really an important question is who do we have as mentors? And I would add one additional thing is that I think the content level is super important, but also, it's good to have a number of people in mind as well, because some people are more compassionate with students, some people are less, some people are, very, very rigid in what they're doing, still good teachers, some people less so. And then also we'll have, I'll just use an example that just happened. There is a different experience of teaching as a woman versus a male versus any racial minority as well, that if you just have a white guy as a mentor, you cannot capture the entire experience of what it's like to teach. So having diversity in your mentors is critical, because there are situations that I will not encounter that many other people will, that are difficult to handle. So that would be a critical piece for any other folks in administrative positions, to have a diversity of mentors on hand so that you can offer real experiences that can be passed on to sessionals, to young people.
If I can sort of follow on to that a little bit, as I was preparing for this panel, one of the things that came to me is that you don't need to have just one mentor who can do absolutely everything. Um, so, I mean, it's absolutely great to have maybe a primary mentor, but there's so many things that go on in a course. On the administrative side, I don't necessarily need to be bugging Beth about the really minutia. If there's someone else who might be able to help a little bit more, and then also the not the workload, but the workload associated with being a mentor can also be divided as well. And um, so I think that's one thing that, as I was preparing for this, that came through, is it doesn't have to be one person. It's amazing if there's one person who can do absolutely everything, but that's not always the case. And even if there is that one person, they may not have the time to be able to do absolutely everything as well. So that was just a thought that I'd had.
I'll admit she might be talking about me because I didn't know how to load exams up to Odyssey. So Jennifer was on her own on that one.
Rachel, do you have anything to add to this discussion?
Sure, yeah, I would agree with what Jennifer just said. I think my experience was similar, that there wasn't sort of one single mentor to answer questions throughout the term. There were different people who were sort of available and willing to help with different aspects. And I think that was useful and good. And different people have different expertises and experiences. And it also felt like I wasn't always going to the same person for questions and taking up all of their time, which was good as well.
Now, I'm curious, just before we move on, for all of our mentorship pairs here, if you can raise your hand if yours was a formal pairing that occurred, if you want to raise your hand, if that was something that was done like formally through your department or something like that, that mentor-mentee kind of relationship. If you want to just raise your hand, we can kind of visually see. So Michael and Zach. And then I'm assuming, so then Rachel, Marcel, Beth, and Jennifer, that was more informal, right? Like that wasn't something where someone came to you and said, you're assigned to this mentor, right? It just kind of had come about.
Correct. Correct. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. And that's good to know, because I know Minzee's going to have us switch in a moment for our Q&A. But my kind of last question is, what advice you have, and this kind of ties off of Carol's question, was what advice do you have for graduate students who are then looking for a mentor? If that's not a formal kind of relationship that exists or that's currently present, what kind of advice do you have for graduate students in trying to seek that mentor? What can they do? And so maybe Rachel and Jen, maybe you're good people to start out with, but feel free anyone to answer that.
I guess it's you have to first figure out what you're looking for, and what sort of expertise you might be lacking or wanting to strengthen, and try to find someone who has that experience and the capacity to be able to help. That would, I guess, be my recommendation.
I guess in biology, Marcel's the undergrad chair and the person who hires sessional instructors and provides the initial training. So was sort of like the obvious first person to go to for questions and things, just because of that. But I also got good input from the last instructor who had taught the course, and from other people throughout the term.
Are there any other comments regarding this topic that the panelists would like to add before we move on to the Q&A session?
I just probably want to echo. I mean, it's clear that all of the pairs here had a good working relationship. And I think one of the potential downfalls with an enforced formal mentorship, like this is your mentor, is that if those people don't click, then and I've had my daughter actually was in a situation like this, then it becomes a real struggle, which is an added stress on the new instructor to in terms of getting through the course because the mentor really is not necessarily giving the types of information that the person needs. So I think that the critical thing is having that open relationship where the experience can be passed back and forth freely rather than enforcing something, but maybe having a list of them or a place that a new instructor could go to ask how to get a mentor or whatever, that could be a more formal part of the process.
Marcel, was there something you wanted to add? I thought you unmuted yourself, but if not, we can move on to the Q&A.
No, I think it was all covered really well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, then for the remaining time for this panel discussion, if there are any questions from the audience for our panelists, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can also leave them in the chat.
Can I ask a question? For the mentees, is there anything that you wish you were told by your mentor that wasn't by the time you're finished?
Minzee, we can include you in that one too, since I was your mentor.
I will say that I'm not just saying this because Michael's in the call with me right now, but honestly, I think he did like every question I ever had, it was answered, and by the end of it, I just left feeling very good about the experience, and it prepared me very well for the next term when I was teaching. So I can't really say that there's something I wish that would have been said more. So yeah.
I should probably admit I did send Zach a lot of very long emails.
I would probably echo what Zach said. Because we sort of had the open door policy where I could go and ask any and all questions, and no questions were stupid questions. I don't really think that there was anything else that I can think of.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I don't think there was anything that was hugely lacking or missing that I needed to hear.
Yeah, me too. When I was teaching Stat 202, there were three sections, and I was teaching a section, and Chelsea was the course instructor, course coordinator. And what I really liked about how we communicated was that Chelsea was very upfront about her expectations, especially when it came to deadlines and creating assessments. So she shared a spreadsheet of like all the dates of when we wanted to create the assignments by and how long we have for, sharing feedback and making changes so that we were never really, being chased by the deadline of creating these assignments. And also for the assignments, she was very transparent about how many questions she wanted in the assignment and what like what kind of material she wanted covered for certain types of questions. So I was I had a clear understanding of the expectations for the assessments and, what type of material needed to be covered for the different types of questions. So, yeah, I don't really have anything that I wish that she had told me earlier either.
So there was kind of in line with some of the questions in the chat and a direct question that I was asked. So as we saw, we had two pairs that had a more kind of informal mentorship that occurred, and then two pairs, if we include Minzee and myself, that had a more formal mentorship pairing. And that's because in our domain, in statistics and actuarial science, we actually have a mentorship program, which is that any instructor, whether they're new or very experienced, anytime they teach a new course, they're assigned a mentor. And that's just someone who's taught the course previously and who is willing to act as a mentor for them in whatever capacity that is decided upon between the pairing. And so that's something that predates my arrival, I should say, to the department. Michael, maybe you recall when it was first initiated. I don't, but I am currently the coordinator of it too. So these pairings actually were because of me. But my question for Minzee and Zach is, did you think that kind of formal mentorship, did it kind of alleviate anything for you, right? Because I know we've heard Rachel and Jen that the advice that you gave for graduate student instructors and in terms of what they might want to consider when looking for a mentor, but Zach and Minzee, did you find it beneficial to have that more formal pairing and mentorship that was provided to you?
Yeah, so I will say, like obviously Michael was the obvious choice for my mentor because he was teaching three other sections of the course. We were going to have to be interacting for the course anyways, so might as well have that relationship where I can also be like, hey, have you seen this before? What would you do in a situation? How should you communicate with students if they ask you a question like this, right? So it was a very natural choice. So in a way, I thought the fact that it was a formal pairing, I thought it was great just because, it kind of put as we were now discussing the course content before the start of the term, we also both agreed upon the fact that I could ask questions just about teaching in general and going through the process. So I would say in my situation, I have no complaints with it. And ultimately too, if I could still go to my, like say my supervisor, who, he's my mentor for research. I could still go to him and get his opinion on something to do with teaching. So it's not like once you have this formal pairing that it completely stops you from talking to other people as well. It just, it kind of maybe gets the ball rolling. And especially, I guess, maybe too, if somebody is somewhat of a more shy person, you would have a hard time kind of reaching out, making that first contact with a potential mentor. Having that formal pairing will, kind of get the ball rolling on that.
Yeah, I agree with Zach. It was yeah, Chelsea was a natural choice for me as a mentor as well because she was the course coordinator. She was teaching two other sections. And I've known Chelsea before because I was her TA for a couple other courses previously before my teaching term. So that was great. It was having a great point of go-to for any contact, any questions I had about the course. For the administrative stuff as well, our department has ISCs, so instructional support coordinators that were kind of handling a lot of the administrative side. And Chelsea and I were in the Teams chat with an ISC as well. So there was a lot of discussion going on there as well in terms of administrative side. So yeah, I really enjoyed having a formal mentor in my teaching experience. Yeah.
Okay, folks, given that we've made it to 11:45, I am going to say thank you to everyone for being a part of this engaging session. Next on the schedule is a lunch break. So I hope you enjoy a chance to get some fresh air, enjoy some lunch. The next start of sessions is at 1 p.m., so take your time. And thanks to all of our participants for this session, and hopefully see you this afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.